So today I am with Eric Jackson from CapLinked. That's CAP Linked, which provides secure virtual data rooms. That's a new phrase on me, so you can bet I'm going to ask Eric about that in one of my questions. But Eric was also the first head of US marketing for PayPal. So he has direct experience of what it's like creating a new payment method that goes from zero to what I would call now PayPal is an internet standard. So you can find out more about the company CapLinked at caplink.com, and we'll get some more links from Eric as we go through the interview and perhaps at the end. But for now, I'll say, Eric, welcome to the Cryptoverse.
Chris, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
It's glad to have you, mate. I looked at some of your other interviews. There were some old ones on YouTube, and just on the strength of some of the stuff you said there, you kind of sound like a bit of a maverick. So I was like, I don't know if you agree with that label, but that's one of the ways you came across back then. And I thought, I like this guy's style, so let's have him on.
Awesome. Well, I've always been happy to say whatever I think needs to be said. And in the world of technology, especially in crypto, there's a lot to talk about. So hopefully I'll deliver.
Excellent. So let's start off with your PayPal experience if we can, because that's no doubt going to set a good frame for everything else we talk about. So like you can talk generally about it, but like how did you get the job? What state was PayPal in at the time? What was your experience during your time there? So give us an insight into that if you can.
Oh my goodness, Chris, this is a great story. So I just started my career. This is 1999. I was working at this very respected financial services firm. It was totally old school, old economy. I had been there for like a year. And the name of the company was one, and this is going to bring a chuckle to many. It was Arthur Andersen, which at the time had a great name. And then, a couple years later, it was taken down in the Enron scandal. So I was just there. And, my perception was like, this is a great place to start your career. You can see a lot of industries. You learn a lot of skills, and you get a brand name on your resume. And it turned out that very quickly I realized a lot of that's not true. That's a myth that people tell you. It's kind of something that, a vested interest would say to make you kind of play their game. And it turns out that you go into an environment like that, they don't reward creativity. They don't really care about developing your individual skill set. Your ability to progress is really based a little bit more on politics than talent. And so there were a lot of reasons why that was not a great environment. Well, enter my friend Peter Thiel. I had known Peter from my years before at Stanford. And Peter and Max Levchin had been working on a little startup named Confinity at the time. It wasn't even called PayPal. And they had just launched their website, which was the PayPal website, and the Palm application went along with that. I was fascinated by it. I was talking to Peter. He made the sales pitch. He said, you should join. You should join right now. We need more people. We'll figure out what you're going to do later. And so I actually went along with it. I guess to a 24-year-old, that made a lot of sense. So I went from like the most structured old school world you could possibly go in from to a brand new startup. And I didn't even have a title or a role.
Wow, that's cool, man. That was interesting that you swung one way to the other. So interesting what you said there about they dangled this carrot, which was like, come and work for a reputable company. It'll be a good resume builder type of thing. And you were like, yeah, it didn't really turn out like that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a false narrative that you need to have something that has, a reputable brand or something that's old and established. And that false narrative, I think, is that, that you need that to somehow shape you and shape the trajectory of what you're going to do. If your goal is to just work at those sorts of big companies, then I suppose that does have currency. But the reality is that it doesn't have nearly the kind of value that you're made to believe it does. And nor does it actually offer the predictability that you think it would. Because who would have thought in 1999 that a company that had been around for 100 years and had 60,000 employees worldwide, Arthur Andersen, would be gone in a couple of years, right? You really can't predict that, sort of the thing that was stable that I started out at and the thing that was risky that I jumped into, those perceptions were wrong. And
Right.
while certainly PayPal could have failed, and there are a lot of ways that it could have gone wrong, it didn't. And the riskier thing was not to have tried the better experience.
That would have been, right? Because that's some of the things I say sometimes is when people say I've got 40 years experience, sometimes it's the same year repeated 40 times. You know what I'm saying?
That's absolutely, yeah, it's absolutely true. There, as I think King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun.
Quite. Absolutely. So you had direct experience working with Peter Thiel, right? So was he obviously wasn't the Peter Thiel of today. What was he? Who was he back then? Was he somebody?
Oh, well, he certainly was. I mean, Peter has been. I've had the pleasure of knowing him a couple of decades, and he's been the same person throughout that entire period of time. Which is meant to be a compliment. He's not somebody that has let success uh, change him in dramatic ways.
Okay.
Peter's thoughtful. He cares about his friends, and I was fortunate that I'd known him from before, and so I was aware of what was going on at PayPal, kind of tracking the things that they were doing, and was excited to have a chance to jump in and work with him and the amazing team he was putting together.
Okay. Do you happen to see the news about his fund investing in Bitcoin?
Yes, I'd heard about that, and I had talked with some folks at Founders Fund previously about that. It is, it's a really cool thing that's. I think that news just recently broke that Founders Fund had been making investments into Bitcoin, but the reality is that they're just ahead of the game. This isn't something that they just started doing because, as many of your listeners will know, if you run a venture capital fund, you have to draft all sorts of legal documents for that fund prior to raising money, and the money raise process and then the eventual deployment of that capital. This all takes years. So they actually wrote it into their fund documents years ago that they could do this. So even though the news of this just became public in the last week or two, this is something that Founders Fund, not just Peter, but the entire team there had insight into doing. And, they actually fashioned the strategy years ago and have been executing on it. So they were definitely ahead of most of Silicon Valley with regard to the value of crypto.
Absolutely. So one of the things I've discovered in my career is the only thing you can really count on are principles, right? Probably my favorite book in the whole world is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And even when Stephen Covey brought out the eighth habit, one of the questions he answers at the beginning is like, are these principles still relevant given you published the book in 1989 or something? And his answer to that was, well, the greater the rate of change, the more complex it gets, the more applicable the principles are, because if the rate of change is so rapid, you have to find some kind of stability. The reason why I'm talking about that is that I'm assuming that Peter and his team, having had that PayPal experience, and perhaps you're going to reveal sort of these principles and how you understand the payments industry, and can see some parallels and some same principles at work that mean you don't get distracted rather by the hype and the newness of crypto, and can just boil it down to spot the principles that are at work and then use that to understand what's going on. Am I making any sense here?
Yeah, I know you are. I mean, the root principles to really understand, what's going on in society, especially in technology where things change so frequently. That's a key. That's a key thing, and I think a key skill set for looking at an industry like crypto. I think if we want to go to really the key set of principles, or maybe the core belief that was behind PayPal, I think that lends some insight into why this is a natural connection for Peter and other PayPal alumni to be drawn into crypto and to see the value and to see it as something useful. We had a belief at PayPal that we weren't just making sort of an online payment system for eBay, right? I mean, that's kind of where it wound up for a number of years after eBay acquired the company. Obviously, that made its focus, become a little bit more constrained, I think is maybe the word I'm looking for. But prior to that, like the original founding vision was that we were creating a new world currency. Well, what did we mean by that? We actually meant an online platform that could be a liberating function that would provide a medium of exchange and a store of value for people around the world, so they'd no longer be dependent to the whims that could go into the governance of fiat currency. And you have to remember that this is kind of the backdrop of the late 90s. There was the Asian currency crisis in which contagion kind of spread around through many developing countries, and they came under pressure because their governments had been manipulating interest rates and exchange rates. And the thing with fiat currency, you can set interest rates or you can set exchange rates. You can't set both. And yet you had central banks for all these governments trying to do that because they wanted to do things that were advantageous to the governments. And then that, because of that incompetency, and then all of the market reaction and volatility, and you could say overreaction, that came to that as these currencies came under attack, governments would often impose very draconian measures. They would restrict withdrawals on bank accounts and things of that nature, that were highly, highly punitive to their own citizens. Imagine you have all of your savings. You've been working in a developing economy. You had all your savings in a bank, and then all of a sudden it's frozen in there, and then hyperinflation gets unleashed, and the value gets wiped out. So it's effectively no longer a store of value. And so, with that backdrop, we actually thought PayPal could be very liberating. This idea of a new world currency that could be accessed through any sort of internet connected device could be very powerful, and also not only give people around the world an alternative to the sort of arbitrariness and bad governance that would often go into to fiat currency, but provide kind of a permanent check on those governments from being able to behave in such bad fashion.
Wow, that's fascinating to me, because the way you were talking there about sort of the thought process and the founding principles of PayPal, you could almost replace that with the way people talk about cryptocurrencies now. You're almost verbatim giving the same pitch, right, for PayPal as cryptocurrencies there. Almost sound like you were talking about crypto. I did not know that was the way PayPal was seen in the early days. So that's, but you said like a world currency, but PayPal doesn't have its own like currency though, does it? It's kind of like having a virtual bank account in a way. So was there ever a plan there to like completely disintermediate the fiat currencies by having a PayPal currency of its own? I don't know.
Yeah, we talked about notions like that. That could there be something like PayPal bucks or something of that nature? We didn't ultimately end up implementing that, of course, because as you're right, I mean, really, PayPal ended up being a great connector that has a lot of robust functionality. I mean, we can't really knock what it's become, but I think the limitation there ultimately is that there's only so much a centralized system can do. As we were building PayPal, we had to drive adoption and make it useful, and piggybacking on top of fiat currencies, specifically dollars initially, but then we gradually started adding other major, more stable currencies like the euro or the yen. That was a way to grow. That was a way to gain acceptance. That was a way to begin this process of building a network and to have a network effect. So our thinking was that if you had a network effect and something that began to expand around the world, then your possibilities could be quite great. So you see what the difference between centralization and decentralization there is, that you had to sort of overcome the chicken and egg problem that you faced with centralization. Was you had to get everyone to accept it. So you had to start using things that people already accepted in order to build a centralized system that had those capabilities. Now, of course, vision ran afoul of reality, and the dot-com crash put a lot of pressure on the company to build out a business model that focused on profitability. So we had to make certain trade-offs, and we also really began to encounter this sort of legal and regulatory challenges that also weigh down on a centralized company. So there were a lot of things that kind of made it difficult to implement that vision. But ultimately, the thing I think that was the big changing factor was getting acquired by eBay in 2002, late 2002. That clearly changed the focus of the company. Peter Thiel and Max Levchin and David Sachs and Reid Hoffman, the senior leadership of the company left at that point. So things changed in a big way, and PayPal didn't really fulfill the vision that it had, even if it could have as a centralized company. But you're right, though. That's what's so exciting. Here we are, a decade and a half later, and we're looking at crypto offering a much more promise, and actually, I think, beginning to provide reality to that vision that PayPal and PayPal's team was talking about, back in 1999, 2000.
Right. That's also fascinating. That sounds like a business model pivot by necessity though, right? You said .com crash, then you've got to make some tough decisions for the survival of the company. You know what I'm saying?
Oh my goodness, Pivot was kind of our middle name. I mean, like here's what's funny about PayPal. We were doing things like having to pivot multiple times. I'll mention that in a second. Get back to that in a second. And then and also having to implement really kind of an early version of lean development before people even thought about that. Lean startup, agile
Yes.
development. That wasn't even a term. Like that wasn't something that people would be talking about until like 2009, 2010. But we were doing something along, as kind of a precursor to that. So before some of the nomenclature and more sort of management kind of refined startup terminology has come along, we're trying to practice those things at PayPal. So in terms of pivots, here's the funny thing about PayPal. That company that Peter Thiel convinced me to join in December of 1999, it would change amazingly within 6 months. So the company had been launched. It had this vision of really handheld devices and really like personal digital assistants. PDAs were the only such tool back in those days, and Palm Pilot was the foremost of the PDAs.
Sure.
And it's so funny to talk about this now, but that idea of like having a digital wallet on your Palm Pilot, which wasn't even internet connected yet, to put it into a cradle that would sync up with your computer,
Yep.
was the sort of the initial vision. The website was almost an afterthought. The idea like, hey, well, you need a website that you can log in to manage your account. And then, oh yeah, if we're using email as unique identifier, then I guess you could just send payments via email as well. So that thing which PayPal became most known for was in a way an afterthought. But pivot number one was to switch platforms and eventually to realize the web was a much bigger engine of growth than the Palm Pilot. And so that became sort of, pivot number one that happened soon after I joined the company. And then pivot number two was to switch focus from person-to-person payments, which the thought was, you can split up your lunch bill or something like that, and focus more on commercial transactions, on online shopping, online business, providing functionality that was easy for consumers and easy to receive for small and medium-sized businesses. And of course, eBay was the foremost channel for that. So that kind of led to a natural connecting of the two. But really, both of these pivots were data-driven. They were just based off of what we were seeing and how people were using it and what people were writing into us to ask to do. So we made a couple of pivots, both in terms of platform and market focus, within the first 6 months that I was there. So, we ended up being something very different than what maybe, anyone had thought we would be in 1999. So that ability to take data, to iterate and, throw out old hypotheses that don't work and try something new, was kind of core to PayPal's DNA before, long before Eric Ries or any of the other Steve Blank or any of the other, really intelligent folks that have coined a lot of the terminology before they had done their work and really made those more widely known concepts.
Absolutely. It's funny. I had this conversation a couple of days ago with someone about it was actually the book, The Lean Startup, wasn't it? That came up with like minimum viable product and all that, what's now pretty common business terminology. And I was saying that a lot of people that use it nowadays, I think they just thought that's always been the biggest lingo. And some people don't know where it came from, right? Because that book is, it's not that old, but it is in business terms, right? It's become so ingrained in the business lingo that we kind of just use it effortlessly now without remembering where it came from. You know what I mean?
No, it's hard completely. And in fact, I mean, talking a minute ago, as you did about Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I mean, I think Eric Ries and his Lean Startup book are, over time going to enter that kind of a stratosphere because of being a classic. And then, and Steve Blank before him, I think, was writing a few years before Eric Ries, but the two of them, I think, did so much to make that feel like common knowledge. But in reality, if you go back 10 years ago, it wasn't.
Yeah, I suppose it comes down to like that branding thing. If you can get your product or your brand into a verb like Google, then you're on your way.
Yeah, you're in good shape.
Absolutely.
But the funny thing is, we were trying to do these sorts of things at PayPal, and it was maybe based a little bit more on intuition, certainly like a rigor, an intellectual rigor, but we didn't have those frameworks and those models. We also were trying to be very rapid in the way we deployed product to market. Waterfall development was still the key way of building product at those times, but by making your waterfalls smaller and doing faster, more sort of continuous development where you're throwing things out, we got a little bit closer to the agile development that people know about and is common today.
Sure, absolutely. When you was talking there, I was thinking about PayPal recently, and the main reason why I use PayPal now is because of, I talk about it on the Cryptoverse quite often. There's an objection to all of this, know your customer and anti-money laundering stuff. The reason I think the users push back against that, and me in particular push back against that, is like, yes, okay, fine, we understand the intention behind it. However, the dark side of that is you are continually creating more and more and more and more and more copies of your personal information in more and more and more and more places. And every time you make another copy of your data on another server with another service provider, that's another potential security breach, right? And of course, if you've got it on 100 different servers, that's a big attack surface, right? So when I see the PayPal option at the checkout, I actually consciously think about that and I say, well, I'd rather not have my credit card details stored on yet another server. Therefore, I'm going to pay with PayPal.
No, it's absolutely true. That sense that if you actually have like a trusted provider that is able to handle this, and protect your data and keep it safe, it's much better to have it, centralized or in that sense, localized to one place as opposed to stored in a unsecure way in many, many others. And I think that was ultimately part of PayPal's value proposition, was to say, like, look, what we are specialists in security. We've developed this amazing encryption system, and we're going to protect your data. And that's proven out over time. I mean, it's been over 18 years, I guess, since the sort of the initial version of PayPal launched. Mm-hmm. And you can hear about security hacks and data loss from a lot of different companies, but there's one you haven't heard it from. And that's not to say that something won't happen at some point, but sure. But the fundamental structure that they used and the approach that they built was very sound. So I completely understand that. Now, you mentioned something interesting there, Chris, though, about like having to provide ID and do the KYC AML steps, and that's something that all of us who've been involved with ICOs and with the token issuances understand that that's a step you have to take. It is interesting to see that the industry is embracing that now, and really out of necessity, because while there's so much talk about regulation around crypto, and believe me, there are some parallels we can draw there with PayPal. I think that could be an interesting subject to explore, regulation for sort of a new and emerging technology. While that's going to happen with crypto, and there's certainly a lot to flesh out with the SEC, the bigger concern I think that a lot of companies have is that this realization that money laundering is a much bigger risk that companies have to be concerned about. So it's actually far more risky, as I understand it, for companies to not do anything to mitigate a charge that money laundering could be happening than it is for them to worry about violating some sort of SEC provision. Because with the SEC, sure, most likely you get, if you're really dumb, you'll probably get fined or have to give the money back from your ICO. If you're caught being part of money laundering, you could go to jail. So the penalties, I guess, a little bit worse.
That's a very good call. That is a very good call. I don't blame the companies for doing the KYC stuff, because they've got the regulators breathing down their neck, right? And like you say, what do you want? Do you want to be caught? I mean, say caught, you might not be complicit in it, right? But if they find that your platform enables money laundering, you didn't do AML properly, then you're going to get criminally implicated rather than civilly implicated. So
yes,
that's a big incentive for companies to not hesitate to do all the KYC stuff. So I
Yeah, so
understand
I'll
completely.
just say to all the listeners, be nice to the company that's asking you for their driver's license. You may not. It's not a fun thing to have to do, and I definitely would like to see the world be different in that regard. But don't blame the company. They're just trying to do the right thing and not wind up behind bars.
Absolutely. So, talk to me a bit about like when did you first hear about the notion of Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, and blockchains? How did that enter your consciousness, and how did it begin to get your attention and stuff?
Oh boy, it was fascinating. I think really like I started paying attention to the space in around 2014, maybe then the months leading up to that time. There just was so much going on. I mean, Bitcoin had begun to get a lot of attention in the news. I was pretty busy with my current company, CapLinked, at the time. It's a cloud company. We'll talk more about that later, I suppose. But so I didn't exactly have a lot of time for side projects, but just to hear about some of the things that had unfolded, and then that would kind of ultimately that period of time in my mind kind of ultimately culminated in the blow up at Mount Gox, which just got so much attention, and I was so interested that I actually wrote an editorial way back then, kind of looking at that experience and contrasting, PayPal's experience to what was going on with Bitcoin, and specifically the way that the Mount Gox kind of black eye, what that meant, and what would sort of the fraud and risk implications be going forward. So that for me was a really compelling time and really interesting to take a look at Bitcoin. But like so many other people, Bitcoin is kind of the gateway drug, right? And it brings you in because it's fascinating, it's brilliant. People might look at it because of the headlines, but then they actually come and look at what the engineering is, and they realize, oh, this is brilliant. This is doing
Hmm.
something that nobody ever did before, and that opened up this world kind of a blockchain. And so I had been for quite some time trying to figure out, wow, is blockchain something I could actually incorporate into my company CapLinked? So that's something that I've been looking at for a long time, and it's really been over recent months that I think we found some really interesting things that we're going to be able to do with it. So it's a love affair that goes back for a few years here, and it's one that's not going to cool off anytime soon.
Right. You mentioned Silicon Valley earlier on. Do you think Silicon Valley is missing a trick in this whole crypto game?
Oh, absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. I can't overemphasize that. Like, uh, so I live in Los Angeles now. So I obviously I spent a chunk of my career up in the Bay Area, and I spent a lot of time going back and forth between the two locations. And I've got to say, as far as the U.S. goes, Silicon Valley has been slow to the game here. I think New York and to some extent Los Angeles have actually been, as tech centers, have been faster to embrace crypto than Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is definitely getting there, and there are plenty of people that have understood crypto and are supporters of crypto, but there's actually a lot of like really antagonistic opposition up there as well. And I think that a part of it is that there's a power structure that's somewhat threatened, right? I think you've got a legacy
Hmm.
network of VCs and angels. There's a lot of money kind of sloshing around Sand Hill Road. And let's face it, it gets disrupted by the whole concept of crypto. The idea that a company could be able to sell a utility token and get significant amounts of working capital that could be used in turn to make the software that they're building. Um,
Yes.
that I think is really unsettling. And when you get down to it, the heart of the venture capital industry isn't really about building great companies anymore. That's not saying there aren't individuals in there that are doing just that. There are. But the heart of the venture capital industry is about assets under management. It's about maximizing the check size they get from pension funds and universities and other institutional investors so that they can grow their funds as large as possible. And
Hmm.
when you have something like crypto come along, that completely threatens that. So there is a real vested set of interests in Silicon Valley that I think is more hostile to it. Now, the smart people, like the people that are really innovators, whether it's a Peter Thiel or Andreessen Horowitz, or there's plenty of people up there that have shown that they got crypto early, and embraced it and have incorporated it into what they're doing, like Founders Fund, as we were discussing a minute ago. So, I think you have to be careful when you kind of talk about, Silicon Valley, because the smartest people there have gotten it and they're on board. But there's a lot of other people that are hostile, and I think it is because they're threatened.
So you make an interesting point there about VCs, right? They were quite happy with all of this disruptive technology coming out of Silicon Valley and so on, as long as they had a controlling stake in those companies, right? What's changed now is the invention of these networked organizations, the decentralized autonomous organizations that aren't really controlled by, a handful of stakeholders. And that then gives rise to the whole crowdfunding through the network token thingy. And now it's a problem because you can't have necessarily a small group controlling the whole network. So perhaps that's where the hostility comes from.
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it, is that it's something that can't be controlled, and I think but I think also just it cuts them out of the business model. Like, so much of what Sand Hill Road has become is just, they get these large checks, and they've got these large amounts of money that they're managing from pension funds. The pension funds and other institutional investors, they don't really care that much about what Sand Hill Road is doing, because it's a small percentage of their assets. They're only putting maybe a couple percent of their money into high risk assets like this. A lot of their money is going into real estate or into, a bond market or treasury bills. So, they're not that concerned about what Sand Hill Road is doing. They just kind of want a nice, cool story. So Sand Hill gets a lot of money and doesn't have a lot of oversight. And for them to have new organizational structures that don't rely on perpetual funding coming from them, and can in fact have a totally different business model that they haven't figured out how to integrate into, I think that's really quite threatening. And I think that means that a lot of venture funds that are somewhere, on the middle section of the bell curve, I think they're going to get into a lot of trouble. Right. The elite funds like Andreessen Horowitz or Founders Fund, they're going to be fine because they're really, really smart. They've got great people. Venture there'll always be some need for venture. And so they'll be able to attract, the great companies, as they currently are doing. They'll keep doing that. Nothing will change for them. But hey, if you're not playing at their level, if you're not in their stratosphere, watch out, because you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time attracting the companies, finding a place to invest. That money is going to eventually dry up. So, that's a real threatening thing. So I think that's why there's a lot of agitation by many in Silicon Valley that's opposed to crypto. And I think the other thing too, that actually is a little bit more cultural. This is a little bit less specific and a little bit less motivated by people's wallet. But I think Silicon Valley hasn't been the leader here. This is one of those areas where they're a follower, and that's an uncomfortable place to be. Silicon Valley has a very high image of itself and really thinks of itself as the leader in everything in the world. And here comes something that's not just emerging, but it's gone global. And they look at that, and it can't be good, can it? It didn't come from us. So I think there's a little bit of that element as well, this realization or this self-image that Silicon Valley has, that somehow it's the best, it's the smartest, it's the true leader in technology. And I'll tell you, that's not true on a number of fronts. Like, I spent some time in China last summer, and I could tell you that what's going on in the tech scene in China is every bit as impressive as what's going on in Silicon Valley. So like that's a bit of a mythology from the very start. But with regard to crypto, it's really leading them to be myopic, and I think missing out on what's the most important technology trend happening in the world today.
Very insightful indeed. So do you think Bitcoin can become like the world currency people tout it to be?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, there's definitely potential for it, to be sure. The sort of the brand equity it's already achieved, the broad name recognition, the underlying architecture is very, very amazing and powerful. There are significant challenges to it as well, and I'm not going to weigh into any debates about about how do you change block sizes or
Sure,
speed up
sure.
transaction speed. I mean, and there's a lot of interesting initiatives like Lightning that are trying to address some of these problems. They do have to be addressed. I think everyone understands that. And Ethereum has its own set of challenges architecturally as well, and they're also their community is hashing that out too. So I think they'll get there. So I do think that those limitations though are significant for Bitcoin. So that those are going to be important to overcome. Um, but I think is what will Bitcoin's ultimate role look like in 10 years? That's an interesting question to ask. Is it going to remain this huge part of the entire cryptocurrency scene? I mean, I think the last graphic I saw, Bitcoin had about 5 or 6 months ago dipped to be something like 38% of the market cap of crypto, or 38% of crypto's total market cap was Bitcoin.
That's right.
And then it's popped back up to like 60%, at least as of a few days ago. I mean, who knows where it is today?
36.8.
Oh, okay. Well, there's a lot of volatility there. So, who knows what that ultimately looks like? I really can't predict. But I think it's here to stay. I think it's meaningful, and I think that just as there's always been demand for gold and silver, because people need alternative currencies that are reliable. They need commodities and other alternatives to currency that are reliable, that can't be diluted by the Federal Reserve and other central banks. So I think it's here to stay. Just how big it becomes, who knows? But I think rather than just talking about Bitcoin itself, I mean, I think if you actually change that question to be crypto, I think the answer is an emphatic yes. I think crypto in some form and sort of the broader market is going to solve so many problems that currently exist today, that it will be embedded as a core part of the way payments happen and the way business gets done in a very short amount of time.
I think that's fair to say, okay, it's probably too extreme to say that Bitcoin will be like the one world currency, but a collection of these currencies that, do one thing better or worse than the next one. And once we've got all of this cross-chain stuff sorted out where you can effortlessly skip from Bitcoin to Litecoin to whatever, then you can just skip over to the specialist and do whatever you want to do with it. And collectively as a basket, they should have all the tools we need to do whatever it is we want to do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's obviously this idea of moving from one currency to another, there's friction around it now, but there won't be in a few years, right? There's going to be different solutions that will solve that. A lot of these things can be automated. And so really you can get to that point where you can just, push a button or tell your phone or whatever to do whatever it is you want it to do. And it'll just happen. So you won't have to think about it so much. So I think that's why I'm extremely bullish on what crypto as an asset class can accomplish. And when you tie that broadly to this idea that it can also be connected to extremely valuable protocols that can do things that actually make things happen, it's going to revolutionize not just software, but it's going to revolutionize business, and it's going to revolutionize life.
Absolutely. There was something in your bio that caught my attention. It said something about how you were instructed to create something called the transactional revenue model at PayPal. Is that what it says? What is that? And that sounds like exactly what most of the cryptocurrencies use in terms of charging a transaction fee to fund the thing.
Yeah, so here's where the listeners go from maybe liking me, hopefully, to really thinking I'm not a good guy, because I'm the guy. I was charged with putting together the original concept of fees with PayPal, and I'll tell you why. PayPal launched with the very grandiose idea that it could make money off the float, that essentially it would be a closed or semi-closed system where money would just sort of recirculate throughout the system. So I'd pay you, you'd pay Joe would pay Jane would pay me. It would just kind of, circle around. And that, back in the late 90s, you had high interest rates. So this idea that you could just have that all be free, there's no cost to the money moving around, and then PayPal, the company, could make a little money off the float. Well, that didn't work out at all. It just didn't. Like interest rates went to zero, and and worse than that for PayPal's business model, that wasn't the behavior that we saw. The transactional behavior was very different. You'd have people receive payments, merchants, they take it out because they had to, buy more inventory or pay the rent or whatever it is they were going to do. And
Hmm.
so, and then people would use credit cards to bring money back into the system, which was expensive because the credit cards would charge PayPal 2 or 3%. So we had to actually implement a transactional model that went away from um, the float model, and move to something that would be what we thought would be fair for consumers, fair for individuals, but also if you were a merchant, to have you paying a fee. So I got tasked with that, and finding a way to actually build a model in place that was based off of transaction volume. So we put together, we did a lot of analysis. We figured out the best way to essentially kind of accomplish that goal of how do you get the maximum impact from the minimum amount of people that are part of that, and put in place a fee system that was based on merchants and their receipt of funds. So, and you know what? Hey, it's still the basic structure that PayPal uses today. I mean, they've changed different levels and settings and so forth. That's evolved over time. But that idea that you could still use it for free for a lot of use cases, you could still use it for free for certain volumes if you're lower, or if you're just doing bank account funded payments, which are free. But if you're going to be like a high volume credit card recipient, there's a fee system attached to it. That's the model that I built way back when, and that's what was, frankly, frankly, pretty important to do back when PayPal was losing like $10 million a month back in
Hmm.
2000.
Sure. I remember like the first time when I was a kid and I heard about how banks are supposed to work, that float model was the way I was taught it. It's like because everyone's money stays in the bank, the bank can provide, no banking fees because they're earning money on the deposits and so on. Of course, since then it's way more complicated than that, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so when you think about it, back to my point earlier about pivots, the company I joined, Peter Thiel, and I really I love the product. I thought Peter was one of the smartest people I knew, and he had a great team. He recruited amazing people. So I was excited to join it. But if you step back and look at it, the business model was all wrong. The float model totally wrong. The platform of PDAs, Palm Pilots, was all wrong, and the customer focus of sort of these C2C, person to person payments, that was all wrong. So like it's very funny to kind of look at what PayPal was like, for day one for me, and what I thought was so cool, which it was cool back in the late 1999, but it turned out to be totally wrong, and it wasn't what PayPal became at all.
Sure. I think now PayPal makes some money on the exchange rate spread as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I think you're right, and there are probably a hundred other ways that they are now, that they're sort of a big conglomerate with what, a $90 billion market cap. So
Right.
things have changed a lot, but at the heart of it, somewhere there's some code there that probably dates back to late 2000 that the team I was working with at the time put in place, that it's still running that transaction fee model. So
Nice.
so
Nice
to
one.
to to all you guys out there that were doing some selling on eBay, and all I can say is I apologize to you. Sorry, but we had to do it. We had no choice.
Absolutely. Hey, just as a quick segue, did you know the Palm Pilot's coming back?
I had not heard that. Oh
Yeah,
my
seriously,
gosh,
I found
that's
a crowdfunding page the other day for, I think the guy who originally designed it. They were saying there's some demand for, because we've run out, we don't have physical keyboards on our phones anymore, right? So the Palm Pilot is like an
right.
elongated device that flips up like the old days, like it's a book style. So you open it up and it has a full size keyboard on it. So it's full size keyboard with screen, like the Palm Pilot was back in the day, but it's obviously got modern hardware in it and all this kind of stuff. And the crowdfunding campaign went bonkers. So there's clearly demand out there for a device like that.
Oh wow. Well, that doesn't surprise me. I was just given for Christmas by my sister one of those retro Atari game consoles. So
Absolutely.
yeah. So if I can go play Centipede and whatever all those 1980 games were, on my TV again with an old Atari, then why not? Yeah, bring back the Palm.
Absolutely. And actually, Nintendo actually brought out their own retro gaming systems, because I think they saw the emulator market kind of eating their lunch there. So they thought, right, if there's a market, let's bring it back.
Yeah, why not? Hey.
Sure. So you wrote this book, The PayPal Wars, right? It's the PayPal Wars: Battles with eBay, the media, the mafia, and the rest of planet Earth. So what made you want to write that book?
It was a story that had to be told, Chris. I mean, that was, when you get down to it, it was just an amazing experience to live through. And I think the ascendancy of the PayPal mafia in the years since have kind of proven that out in some sense, right? That the people that were involved were incredibly talented and intelligent people that would go on to shape so much of tech in Silicon Valley. So I think in some sense that kind of proves that like there was something incredible. But what was incredible about it was the obstacles that PayPal had to overcome, and hence kind of the title and subtitle. And it's fun. It's meant to be give you a little chuckle because it gives a sense of like everything's kind of coming after PayPal. But that really was the case. And I think there's some lessons that actually apply to crypto in some sense, because we saw this. It almost felt like what's next, what's going to come at us next, who's going to throw the kitchen sink. But we had just a long list of kind of a rogues gallery, like besides sort of fraud and this idea of like foreign mafia rings kind of targeting us. We had our own government, we had regulators, we had Elliot Spitzer from New York come after us. We had the state of Louisiana try to ban PayPal. We faced scalability challenges. The media switched sides on us. They loved us. We were awesome at one point, and then everything we did was horrible. So I think there's just it was interesting when you're trying to build something that shakes up existing power structures. That you're going to get pushback. And I had a recent editorial. My Kaplan co-founder and I wrote a recent editorial for VentureBeat where we talked about this. It's called Cryptocurrencies Accomplishing PayPal's Original Mission. So they published that about a month ago, so early December. And, we were making this point that these things are going to be likely challenges for the crypto industry as well. So, I think raising this up as an issue for people to think about is good, and also important because we don't want people to get sort of disheartened when we hit bumps in the road, because the industry will hit bumps in the road. Yeah. It already has, but there'll be more, and they'll be bigger this time because more people are paying attention and more people are kind of playing in the broader ecosystem now.
Right. So it's like, don't panic. This is perfectly normal. Whenever you try and innovate, you get all this pushback.
It's going to happen. Yeah, it's absolutely going to happen. And you're going to have, whether the, Bitcoin, I mean, there's any type of scenarios. Bitcoin could, drop $10,000 and then you start getting all these terrible news stories about how awful it is. Or, our government could, which has kind of been on the fence and not, it's hard to know where different agencies stand on it, could become more hostile, or, any number of things, right? So just, don't panic. These things will happen. And then, in fact, they're kind of a hallmark of success. If you've built something that has value, if you've built something that has meaning and is gaining momentum, then you have to expect these challenges will come. So I fully anticipate that we'll see, some choppy times at different points ahead for crypto. But in some sense, it's not only expected, it's a good thing. It's because, it's an ecosystem that matters. It's a movement that matters. And it's a technology that's meaningful.
Absolutely. So one last point on your book before we move on here. So I read here that Tom Peters said that there's a business strategy in your book that he said was the greatest description of a business strategy when it comes to an industry that's changing at warp speed. So I'd say that's certainly the case in crypto, like warp speed change. So what on earth is this strategy, and how does it apply to crypto?
Well, I think Tom Peters was speaking to the ability to have inside of a company frank and candid dialogue about how to adapt to how quickly the market changes. So talking about all these different oppositions that PayPal faced and these challenges, and eBay was actually a big part of that challenge as well, as the title of the book implies. eBay was not happy to have PayPal showing up and getting customers off of its platform. but it's the small businesses on there needed a payment mechanism, and the customers, they wanted one. So we had a lot of opposition, and I think that ability to move quickly based on what's changes that are happening externally out in the marketplace is really what Tom Peters is speaking about, and that's applicable for crypto as well, right? I mean, crypto companies are doing a great job of trying to engage the community, being out there on Reddit and Telegram and just talking to people, getting stakeholders. The companies that are doing their token generation events well are the ones that also make sure that they're not just selling tokens, but they're also providing some sort of token incentive programs and bonus programs for the people in the community that should have some sweat equity, right? That have helped build things or contribute, So I think in some ways, what Tom Peters was talking about in my book, I think that the good companies and the good organizations in crypto are doing just that.
Sure, absolutely. So where does CapLink fit into all this? And what on earth is a virtual data room?
Virtual data room. So that's CapLink is a cloud application that is for the secure sharing of data, and businesses use it when they need to send data outside of their figurative four walls to some other outside party to work with it, review it, access it, but not to keep it. And so situations that often involve something like that can be like a transaction. So it could be like a merger or a financing, the sale of an asset. So you can imagine sending hundreds or thousands of documents like, sensitive HR contracts, financial records, different types of intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. But other situations that are sort of ongoing business operations like licensing deals, audit, business development, all these situations are ones in which you have, voluminous amounts of data that you might need to send to some outside party, but you don't want them to keep it. So you're not going to put that stuff in Dropbox where,
Sure.
there's some control, but not a lot. So CapLink is a platform to lock it down, encrypt it, restrict printing, track who's accessing it. You can let people download the file, but the owner of the file can still see that it's being used, and they can cut off access even if it's downloaded. So so we've built a system around that, and so we've really been focused though on crypto and blockchain over the last few months, and we've recently announced a partnership with Storage, the decentralized storage company.
Yes.
So we've started to work with them, and we're going to be building some applications that will allow for additional kind of permissioning and controls for files that are stored in storage. So as a value add for both sides. So that's something we're really excited about. And we've got a lot of other news that'll be coming out over the weeks ahead as well.
Okay. I actually did an interview with Sean Wilkinson, who I think he still is the CTO of Storage.
Yeah, or CSO or something like that. But yeah, Sean's a brilliant guy, as are all of his colleagues over there. We've had a good opportunity to work with his colleague John Quinn, and also Philip Hutchins. So Storage is a great project, and I would definitely give a big shout out to them. So if anyone hasn't had a chance to check out Storage, and that's spelled STORJ, go check them out. It's a great project that they're working on, and definitely something for people to look into, because it's a cool alternative to like AWS and other centralized file storage systems.
Absolutely. One thing that struck me about Sean is he's got a lot of energy. He's really enthusiastic. That really got me when I spoke to him. It was a really enjoyable interview because of that.
Yeah. So you know what? I'm gonna have to go back and download the podcast and listen to it now, because he's got really interesting things to say. So so we look at this like CapLink coming from enterprise and coming from the cloud. And we've got our customers are they really run the spectrum, but I mean it's a lot of larger companies like Roche or DaVita Healthcare Partners, or Hess, the big energy oil company, Ernst & Young, so it's a lot of financial services and pharma and energy and, companies like that are involved with transactions and managing data. So we've kind of come out of that, very blue chip kind of world. I mean, God, if Arthur Anderson were still around, Chris, we'd probably be working with them.
Hmm.
But we've come out of that. But what I've realized is that there's so much happening in crypto that being able to take the innovation in crypto and bring that back to the enterprise, I think is a huge opportunity. And I think that, in the early days of crypto, and I think we're still in the early days. I think this is where a baseball game, it's maybe the second inning, so there's a lot of ball left to be played. But, it's always the early adopters and technology evangelists, enthusiasts that show up early on. But, I think we're starting to see that enterprise is really is waking up. They've embraced blockchain, and now they're starting to take a look at crypto. And I think that's going to be a real opportunity that the CapLink is eager to partner up with and to do some innovation itself in that area.
Sure. So when did the idea of CapLink first come about? Was that a logical extension of your experience up to that point, or something else?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, to some extent, that was something that my co-founder Chris Gray and I thought up back around 2010, and so it went through several different iterations. But the basic idea was that it's hard to manage these situations where you've got to share data with other parties. You can give data to people very easily, but this idea of sharing and controlling and then bringing the data back, it's actually a complicated thing to accomplish. And there's a lot of solutions out there like Box or Dropbox or SharePoint, cloud-based solutions that do just fine for kind of collaboration. So if you're a team and you're working on a document together, or Google Drive, those are great solutions that work really, really well internally. But this idea of these use cases where, no, I need to send the data outside the company and it's got to go to someone else, maybe a lot of other people, but we don't want them to keep it because it's sensitive. Bringing that and being able to send it out and bring it back, that's a hard thing to accomplish. And there's apps that'll do that on sort of like a one-off basis, like for tracking like a slide deck or something like that. But how do you do it for hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of files and documents and other pieces of digital assets? That's a big problem. So that's what we were excited to tackle.
Gotcha. So there's the big piece there is the permission and the authentication pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah, and the tracking as well. Tracking becomes a key part because of the value proposition around just being able to know who saw what when. That if there's ever a dispute, if there's theft, if there's any litigation in the future, having an ironclad record of that data is very important. We see people download reports out of CapLink all the time. Activity reports. They'll do it quite frequently. So you can imagine that's extremely valuable. Right now, we're obviously addressing that as a cloud-based solution. We're currently addressing that with we've got a database reports that run, and we allow people to download CSVs and things like that. But you could imagine that there might be other alternatives out there, like that would be decentralized and immutable. That might be really interesting ways to address that. So I'm just going to tease that we have some really cool new technology in the works that is going to take advantage of some of the emerging tech out there in blockchain and crypto that's going to take this core value proposition a step further and actually make it even more useful.
Okay, that sounds like an ideal note to end on, a bit of a mic drop there. But before we do, is there anything that I missed that you want to make sure we talked about before we close?
Well, no, Chris, I think we actually had a chance to cover a lot of great topics, and we will there will be some news coming from CapLink further about what I just teased in a couple of weeks. So be on the lookout. Anyone that's interested, follow me on Twitter if you like, at Eric M. Jackson. On Twitter. Don't forget the M in the middle there. That's my middle initial, Michael. So I'd love to hear from people. That'd be awesome to get any feedback that people have. And most of all, I just want to thank you, Chris. You've got a great show. I really appreciate that you are an advocate for the community overall. we need thought leaders like this, and we need a thoughtful discourse like this because, like I said, there will be tough times ahead. Everyone, don't forget that. That's maybe my lesson to impart. Like, if PayPal's existence and story is anything of an indicator, there'll be tough times ahead. But also, that's just because crypto is doing it right, and crypto is, I think, has such huge potential that we're going to see. We'll have a few rainy days, but for the most part, it's going to be a lot of sunshine and a lot of great destinations that we're going to see this broad movement go to.
Superb. Well, thanks for the praise. I'll make sure I put the link to your Twitter and to the CapLink website in the video description and the show notes for this episode of the Cryptoverse. But for now, Eric, thanks very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Chris.